Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined for a second time by Dr. Azar Gat. He is Ezer Weizman Professor of National Security at Tel Aviv University, and today we're going to talk about his book, Nations, the Long History and Deep Roots of Political Ethnicity and Nationalism. So, Dr. Gat, thank you again for coming on the show. It's a pleasure to have
Th-
you on.
Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, so let's start with the basic question. What is nationalism?
So, nationalism is the political expression at the state level of the deep sentiment of affinity, shared identity, and solidarity, which people feel towards the kin culture community. That's my summing up of the concept.
Mhm. So you use the term kin culture community. Could you explain that? What is that about?
So in most with most nations, people belong to the same ethnic group. So they regard each other like an extended family. And even in those cases where, for example, nations are composed, say, let's take the most extreme cases of immigrants that come from various places. Over time, within a few generations, they mix and they all adopt a shared culture of often, uh, obviously changing their language and so much else. So even in these cases, over time, there develops a sense of kin culture community, which is obviously even more evident in more established nations.
Mhm. So would you say that ethnicity is at the basis of politics?
Ethnicity is a very strong factor
Hmm.
in the shaping of politics. Obviously, there are also other factors, but ethnicity is a very strong factor, and it has been overlooked and dismissed by some trends in recent scholarly schools, mostly within liberal societies.
Mhm. Mhm. So, when it comes to nationalism, if I'm not mistaken, there are two different approaches that historians have. One is modern and the other is primordial approach to nationalism. Could you tell us about the difference there?
So let's start with the modernist view. The modernist view emerged sometime around the 1930s and has become very popular since the 1980s. And basically, it goes against what people traditionally felt about nations, that they have a long historical pedigree, that they are deep rooted, and so forth. And what modernists claim was fundamentally that nations and national sentiments are something new, that they emerged. Sometimes there are different schools here. Some would say with the emergence of print technology, which connected people across countries. Some would say from the French Revolution. Some would say with the Industrial Revolution. Only then, according to the modernists, you have communities or collectives that share identity and affinity among them. According to this view, peasants or pre-modern societies, which were mostly composed of peasants, had only local identities. They were not aware of any broader affinities or sense of belonging. And obviously, some of the modernists also regard modern nationalism as no more than manipulation by state authorities that create myth in order to establish the long pedigree of the nation and so forth. Now, there is a sophisticated element to the modernist claim because we all know, obviously, that national myths abound, and we are all aware that obviously there is also political manipulation of these sentiments. But I think, having said that, I think that the modernists are wrong. Obviously, there is manipulation, but manipulation of existing feelings. You need these feelings to be very deep-seated in order to be able to manipulate them so successfully. And the other claim by, as you call them, primordialists, I don't like this name, so let's call them traditionalists, argued that pre-modern nations very much existed, that collectives had a very robust sense of common identity before modern time. And obviously, modernity made a difference. We'll talk about this probably later on. But to argue that a common sense of ethnic and in its political aspect, national belonging did not exist before modernity is belied by any historical investigation of past societies.
Mm-hmm. So, according to this traditionalist view, as you call it, nationalism comes before modernity, let's say. I mean, it doesn't matter really if modernity is about the printing press or the Industrial Revolution or the French Revolution or something like that, but it comes well before that. So how far back do we need to go to find the first nations?
Okay. So first of all, in the framework of the discussion of nationalism, it's often the case that the term tribalism is mentioned. And people are well aware that long before states, people were loyal, fiercely loyal to their tribe, obviously. And it's sometimes mentioned by perplexed commentators who do not understand the deep roots of nationalism. They invoke the term tribalism in such cases, but they don't understand the real connection here. That is, in the same way that tribes used to elicit this deep sense of loyalty by their members, once tribe and tribal societies developed into statehood, and in a minute I'll say when this happened, the same sentiments have been now expressed in the framework of states, and hence can be called nationalism. Now, when did this begin? It began with the very first states. So the first states emerged 5,000 years ago, around 3000 BC. And these states largely fall into three categories. We'll probably say a bit more about this. We are aware of city-states, like those in Sumer, in Mesopotamia, in ancient Mesopotamia. There are multi-ethnic empires. We'll talk about them separately. And there were those kingdoms that centered on a particular people. For example, Egypt, one of the earliest states ever, again emerging as a unified country around 3000 BC, was a national kingdom. That is, it was rooted in a particular people, that is the Egyptian people, of a very strong ethnic character in terms of its culture, in terms of its language, in terms of its sense of common identity, obviously ritual and everything else. Obviously, the Egyptian state reinforced all these elements and forged from them a common national identity, but it was easy to do because the making of all these were there. This was one ethnos with all the trappings of an ethnos. So one of the first state, Egypt, can be regarded as the first national state. Obviously, Egypt, ancient Egypt, also possessed an empire. That is, Egypt conquered other countries outside of Egypt. But still, Egypt, the country and the people formed the nucleus of the empire. There was a clear difference between the national state and its empire, in the same way that, say, the British Empire revolved around Britain. It was never in question, or the French Empire and so forth.
So what is at the basis of these national identities? For example, how do people move from a tribal identity, an identity that they share in their tribe, to a state identity, for example?
So it's a complex question, obviously, and it involves different developments in different places. We are aware, for example, that tribal identities survive in some places of the world, even within states, whereas in other state society, tribal identities, which obviously existed there some millennia or sometimes centuries ago, are eradicated. And I won't get into this in full because, as I said, it's a complex question. For example, in the Middle East, where I live, tribal societies survive for various reasons. One of them is a pastoralist existence, other is weak states, and so forth. But basically, the change involves the creation of state institutions that take over some of the most vital functions that were previously played by the tribe. For example, defense or judgment. That is, you no longer need to rely on your kin in order to get justice, that is private justice. There are now state institutions that do it. And there are other processes that usually, when state arise, erode the tribal form of human organization. Even though in many states, in many ancient states, we know that the tribal organization remains, even by name, not necessarily in reality, but the names of the old tribes, sometimes even some of the institutions, mostly relating to ritual, sometimes remain.
So, can we say that there is a set of conditions that have to be set in place for people to evolve from, let's say, a tribe to a chiefdom, a state, an empire? I mean, it could be ecological conditions, social conditions, economic conditions, political conditions. I don't know. Is there, do we know what are the factors behind that kind of evolution?
Yes, we do. So first of all, what you need is almost universally, what you need is the agricultural revolution first, which involves both farming and pastoralism. And agriculture, what the coming of agriculture meant was, first of all, the emergence of much denser human societies, because agriculture is much more intensive. So you have large scale societies, very populous, societies emerging with, as I said, the dense population and so forth. You also have greater stratification because of the rising differences in terms of property. Once you have property, you have rich people and you have poor people. And the rich are the powerful also. So they call the shots in society. And from there, it's only a short step, as you said, first to chiefdom, that is one of them becomes supreme. And then the most crucial step to statehood. What statehood involves is two main things. One is the creation of some kind of bureaucracy that runs its territory, which in turn means that the nation state needs instruments of economic extraction, that is taxation, in order to finance itself. And almost invariably, this also goes with military forces, which enforce the state authority both inside and outside. Once this step is taken, and as I said, it was first taken in the ancient Near East or Middle East, and then in other places around the world, in China and independently in pre-Columbian America and so forth. Once this step is taken, you have the first states. And once you have the first states, they put pressure on the environment, on the neighbors, and encourage them or push them into statehood themselves because of the pressure of state societies, which forces tribal societies to organize themselves as states in order to be able to withstand the pressure from neighboring state society.
Mm-hmm. And how do people develop these national identities? Is it a process that goes around or comes around bottom up, or is it the other way around and it's imposed from above?
So it's a two-directional process. You need, so obviously you have the state authority, but the state authority cannot, it's very difficult for it to forge a common identity. Sometimes it may take centuries, and it's most often, it might break down. You need an ethnic space which is common and which has, some attributes, shared attributes, such as language, such as ritual, which is the almost universal prerequisite for the state to work on. Once the state exists, obviously it reinforces these traits. It consolidates ritual, various local rituals into a state religion. It takes into its realm the conduct of religious ritual, because this is such a powerful cultural and ideological template which the state is built on. So in order to create this sense of shared nationhood, you need an earlier ethnic infrastructure in the great majority of cases.
Mm-hmm. So earlier you mentioned city-states. Why is it that we call some of these political organizations city-states instead of simply states?
Because they are so small, and because they coalesce mainly around the city. What is special about city-states with respect to the ethnic and national identity? Take, for example, classical Greece, or take ancient Mesopotamia. What you have there is a common ethnic infrastructure divided among smaller political identities. So, for example, in ancient Greece, the Greeks knew very well that they were one and the same ethnos. They had no doubt about it whatsoever, and that all those who were not Greek were outsiders, were barbarians. In the same way, in Sumeria, people knew that they all belonged to the same ethnos. They shared language, they shared culture, they shared deities, and so forth, obviously with local variations. So what you have here is a common ethnic space divided into a number of political entities. Now, this is on the one hand. On the other hand, it's also the case that each of these smaller polities had its ethnic underpinning. All of them had an ethnic underpinning. That is, they were Greek. They were not, say, all the city-states of ancient Greece were their people were Greek. They had this clear understanding that the Athenians, that Athens belonged to its people, which was Greek, and foreigners which flocked into Athens because of its economic prosperity, say in the 5th century, were foreigners, precisely that. So, as I said, ethnic underpinning was crucial to the identities, to the identity of city-states.
Mm-hmm. And what happens when a particular state conquers other peoples and they are included in it as an empire? I mean, how do the dynamics change there? How do people, for example, that were part of the original state or nation look at the new people that come in?
So obviously, we are simplifying here because it's difficult to go into all the intricacies covered in the book. But basically, what you have is, as you said, one ethnos or one people conquering others, thereby creating a multi-ethnic empire. In some places of the world, this becomes the dominant form of political organization. In other places, not. And in such cases, what you have is obviously the suppression of national identities by the others. What you have is the empire predominantly, even though it presents itself, and in some way also fulfills the ideal of comprehensiveness. In reality, it relies above all on its ethnic core in order to dominate the empire. That is, it brings also in, it includes, it co-opts people from outside the ethnic core, but still it relies mostly on its ethnic core in order, on the imperial peoples, as it were, in order to rule the empire predominantly by at least the implicit threat of force, sometimes the explicit use of force. So yes, so it's not, empires are not, obviously not ethnically homogeneous, on the contrary. They are multi-ethnic, but at the same time, they rely heavily on the ethnic character of the imperial ethnos or people.
Mm-hmm. What would you say about the case of China? Because it seems to be the oldest, at least the oldest state that still exists. It has existed for more than 2,000 years now, right? So is there something special about it in comparison to other nations?
Even before 2000, formally China was united at the end of the 3rd century BC,
Yeah.
but in practice, Chinese culture and mega states existed from, say, the middle of the 2nd millennium BC. With the Shang and the Chao, the first dynasties. So what you have there is a kind of an expansion of an ethnic core that existed in the north of China, the Yellow River, which was united, as I said, in the 2nd millennium BC by ruling dynasties in this region, and gradually expanded mainly by way of conquest to cover the south of China, bringing with them their language, which obviously diversified over time. So we have several Han languages, and their culture, the Chinese civilization, which over time connected all these provinces together, tied them together as a common both cultural and political identity. And this also accounts for the fact that about 90% of the people in China today are Han Chinese. That is, they speak Chinese languages and they share Chinese culture, a script, culture, and everything that goes with it. The political and philosophies, all the huge cultural baggage that Chinese civilization signifies. Whereas only about 10% of China, of today's China, are minorities. That is, they do not fall within the classification that I've just described. And we hear about some of them, the Uyghurs, the Turkic in northeast, northwest China, Tibetans, and so forth, and some other in the southwest, in the south west of China.
Mm-hmm. There are historians that talk about nationalism in Europe in the Middle Ages. Is there something special about that period and this specific continent?
So first of all, in my view, the first European nation far predated the Middle Ages, and I think that the first one should be regarded as ancient Macedonia, the country that existed even before but was consolidated even more by Philip II and then by his son Alexander before he took on conquest of Asia. And even after they left, Macedonia remained as a national state. What characterized Europe and made it so unique is that its fragmented landscape. Europe is divided thoroughly by its geography, by the sea that separates the seas that separate its various parts, by the steep mountains that separate it. So when the first polities emerged in the ancient Mediterranean, that is mostly in Greece and Italy, which are peninsula both and very mountainous, the form of polity that emerged was the city-state. And it was only when states spread north of the mountains. As I said, the first case is Macedonia, but then all of the Mediterranean was swallowed by the Roman Empire. But once the Roman Empire fell, there emerged by the late first millennium national states, that is, states that centered on specific ethnic groups and identities all across Northern Europe. And this is why we see the beginning of the European national states in medieval times, or the takeoff of most of them.
Mm-hmm. So, because Europe was so fragmented in comparison with other regions of the globe, is that one of the reasons why Europe reached modernity earlier than other parts of the globe?
So there are various factors explaining the so-called rise of the West. I think that this political fragmentation was one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Because in contrast to the large imperial blocs that constituted both West, East, and to a large degree some parts of Southern Asia, power was not monopolized. So competition among these political units was intense, and it was practically impossible to suppress initiatives. Because, you know, in China, for example, the great exploration, the great naval exploration that took place during the first decades of the 15th century, and led to huge Chinese fleets all the way to Africa, East Asia, and so forth. All of them stopped in an instant when the Chinese court decided to close the business, sometimes in the 1430s. This was not possible in Europe. You know, if Portugal was to drop the ball, there would be others who would pick it up. These pluralism or fragmentation of the European state system promised greater competition and a more intense initiative that could not be suppressed as in other parts of the world. Mm-hmm. Of Eurasia, basically. Mm-hmm. Also, the Europeans were poor. You know, they were tucked in the far end of the Eurasian landmass. They did not have access to all the goods of Central and Eastern Asia. They wanted access. They were poor, and they wanted, they had to go out on their exploration, from the later part of the 15th century, Portugal leading the way, and then joined by Spain, and mostly in the Americas. And thereby, they became the masters of the first global trade system, which gave the initial boost to the rise of the West.
Mm-hmm. But were there any particular reasons why Europe was never united under a single empire? I mean, could it have something to do with its geography, with its climate, or other factors?
Yeah, I think that geography explains a lot. I mean, it was never possible. Never possible to bridge over all these seas, to cross all these mountains. In each of them, in each such niche, independent people, defended itself ferociously. Empires mostly emerged in open spaces. So the Middle East, relatively open. The north of India, Central Asia, Persia, East Asia were much more open, less divided by seas, by mountain ridges, and so forth. It tells us a lot. Take, for example, the greatest nomadic empire ever, the one created by the Mongols. But also all other nomadic peoples before the Mongols. There was a whole series of them. The Huns, the Scythians before them, the Magyars, and so many others. All of them were able to overrun the steppe. They were able to overrun Eastern Europe. They were never able to go further than the Hungarian plain. That is, they were never able to penetrate Western Europe. The only answer to this is because of geography.
Mhm. So, in the Middle Ages, Europe was influenced a lot by the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church. So, did it play a role in how nations developed in Europe?
Obviously, it did in many ways, but at the same time, we need to remember people talk a lot about the universal message of Christianity, of the Catholic Church. And obviously, it created this common sense of Christendom. That is, that all the countries of Europe belong to the same culture, to the same civilization, to the same religious sphere. Obviously, all this existed in medieval times and also later. But at the same time, people forget, I think, that there was also within this universal church, there were national churches in all of the Christian countries. And if almost invariably, they supported the national cause. So the church in the English church supported the English monarchy, unless they came to clash on religious affairs. But in terms of national conflict between the states, it was mostly the case that the church in England supported England, the church in France supported France, and so forth, to say nothing of Eastern Europe, where, for example, in countries like Serbia or in countries like Greece that fell under foreign rule, mostly obviously the Ottoman later on, it was the church that preserved, above all, the local sense of not only religion, but also national identity. They came together. It's often in the literature described as if religious identity contrasted with national identities, whereas in reality, the opposite was true. The sense of religious identity was one of the mainstays of national identities everywhere. Same in Poland, same in Russia, same in Hungary. In any countries that you can name, this would be the case.
So there are some old nations, like for example Egypt, Greece, that changed a lot over time. I mean, I would imagine that the
Sure.
Egyptian identity 2000 plus years ago is not the same as it is today. So, but is there something that comes from back then that still influences the identity of modern people from those countries?
So it depends, again.
Yeah.
It depends. And this is why I don't like the term primordial. Primordial suggests that national identities, and I might have given the impression that national identities are constant. Obviously, they are not. They change all the time, even if, even if the same label is put and there is a strong continuity in this identity, they change all the time, and sometimes they transform beyond recognition. So if you mention, for example, if you mention Egypt identity was deeply transformed, including language, by the Arab conquest in the 7th century, which transformed entirely. It took some centuries to unfold, but the countries completely changed its identity, changed its language, changed its culture, changed its religion. All of them went together. And so, above all, Egyptian identity from medieval times became intimately tied with the Arab identity and with the religion of Islam. Obviously, there are some, especially in modern times, some pride in Egypt, ancient history as one of the oldest civilization on earth. But the basic, and obviously there are, a strong sense uh, of local nation identity. That is identity which is Egyptian. But beyond this, the main attribute of Egyptian identities are Arabic, Islamist, and so forth. So sometimes the changes can be so radical as to change completely the content of and some nations obviously dissolve and disappear. There is a very long catalog of nations that are no longer with us, and so forth. So a process of transformation, change and transformation, obviously takes place all the time. In some cases, it can be it's more noticeable and radical. In some cases, less so. So, for example, Greek identity obviously now draws more from its Christian Byzantine past rather than from its classical roots, even though the Greeks are obviously very conscious and very proud of their ancient inheritance. But the Christian element, which came with Byzantium and with the memories of Greek greatness during Byzantine times, predominated during the 19th century and also later.
Can we talk about modern nations, and if so, when did they start exactly, and what differentiates them from older nations?
So what the modernists say is partly true, and nobody would deny it. So, for example, the emergence of print technology from around, from the late 15th century, and later on, connected all these national communities by this major communication technology. So they were now connected by a shared diet of books, increasingly in the native tongue, in the vernacular, in the native tongue of the people. So obviously this is a major force connecting people together. And then obviously the Industrial Revolution, one of its elements in the 19th century, one of its elements was obviously, as we all know, the movement of people. 90% of pre-modern societies, people lived in the countryside. They now moved very swiftly from the countryside to the cities. And this had two effects, major effects. One was that local identities were very much eroded. And the other, that all these people that were thrown together in the new urban centers became even more connected in terms of culture, in terms of identity, in terms of their daily dealings, in terms of language, in places where dialects were strong. Not in all places they were strong, dialect differences. So, and to this came, were added by, in the late 19th century, these two much talked about institutions such as elementary education, that is schooling, which together with, as they used to say, with read, write, and do the numbers, they also instilled the sense of common national identity history of the nation, of the country, and so forth. And also compulsory military service. That was another institution that cemented this sense of shared identity. So obviously modernity made a huge change, and it's not surprising that it has, because modernity, except for the agricultural revolution, is the most profound revolutions in the history of humanity. So modern nationalism is much more potent than it used to be, but it's wrong to believe, as modernists believe, that it was created by modernity, that no such common identity was felt before. And let me mention, if it's all right, some examples that will show that pre-modern nations did have, or peoples did have, a sense of common identity. So think, for example, of Jeanne d'Arc. This peasant girl from a village in Lorraine. How did she know that its country was occupied by a foreign people, by the English, and that they must leave France, that she belonged to a collective known as France? According to the modernists, this should not have been possible, but she heard about it everywhere, in the Sunday sermons, in the local church. People may not have known how to read, but they were read to and preached to in religious ceremonies, rituals, and so forth. So it's not the case that only with the printing press, the tools were forged for communication on a large scale. Let me just give two more examples because they are really telling. So, for example, think of Russia, this vast land of peasants, supposedly isolated from one another, thoroughly suppressed, oppressed by their social superiors. Once an invasion of the country took place, there was a huge patriotic arousal against the Swedes, against the Poles in the early 17th century, against the Swedes in the early 18th century, against Napoleon in the early 19th century. So the least modern people in Europe, the Russians, were able to mobilize, rely on popular enthusiasm to save the country, to save the motherland against invaders. And this took place everywhere. Peasants, thoroughly oppressed by their superiors in times of national emergency, the authorities would appeal to them and the masses would respond. So even though they couldn't read and write, so they did not leave testimonies of how they saw the world, their action speaks volume, because once by a foreign invasion, their reaction tells us that they see the foreigners as foreigners and they want them out. And they would be prepared, they were prepared repeatedly to risk life and limb in order to liberate the motherland.
Mm-hmm. So the modernists say, for example, that before things like universal education and compulsive military recruitment, that people didn't really have a common national identity, or at least there were certain cultural elements that the common people, the peasants, lacked because they weren't exposed to that kind of knowledge. Let's say it was only part of the elite culture, let's say. So would you agree with that?
No, I don't agree. And as I said, what modernists deny is not the existence of pre-modern nations. What they deny is the existence of pre-modern peoples. And this is thoroughly false. The people had a very clear sense that they were English, or side by side with their local identities, and their local identities were very strong. At the same time, they knew that they were English or Paul or Dan or Portuguese for that matter, or Swede or Norwegian. They knew it for centuries. And as I said, the modernists overlook the powerful effect of pre-modern means of communication and acculturation, that is ritual, that is festivals, that is preaching by the literati, by the local priest, the common ritual, the network of ritual institution, temples in ancient times, churches later, that spread around the countries, that reached even the most remote rural places, that acted as agents of a shared national identity. So there was a variety of non-literate means by which people were, by which this shared identity was disseminated.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that people really need a national identity for them to have social cohesion?
I don't know if I don't know if they need it, but the fact remains that they exhibit. We see around, and modern studies show this very clearly, that there is a close link between the ability of people to share resources with their own people rather than with foreigners. And if a country is very much fragmented on ethnic grounds, or that it regards its poor as scarcely part of the national fabric, say in the United States, where the black community for very long was regarded as not quite as part of the national community. So the willingness of people to support in terms of welfare policies those that do not belong to their own people is obviously quite weaker, and studies show this very clearly.
Mm-hmm. So, what would you say are some of the most prominent cultural elements of nationalism? I would imagine that, for example, religion would play a big role there, perhaps not in many nations nowadays, but historically.
Historically, obviously, still today, but much less so. Other religion should here be viewed as in its cultural aspect. That is, it constituted very much not only the ideological but also the cultural makeup of this collective. Other cultural attributes partly always played a role, but in many cases have now surpassed religion as the main cultural attribute. For example, language has always been, past and present, has always been a major element of national identity. because it's such an elementary element of collective life, of common identity, and so forth. So people tend to regard those who speak the same language, those who look like them, those who behave like them, those who share the same culture as part of we have this intrinsic mechanism to identify them as part of our kin culture collective. And, you know, there are historical traditions that bound people together, narratives, myth, obviously, and so forth, that make national identities.
Mm-hmm. What is the difference between nationalism and patriotism?
I don't think that there is, you know, much difference. Some scholars have tried to make this distinction. Supposedly, nationalism was bad, and we understand why it should be so regarded. Because during, during much of the late 19th century, during the early 19th century, nationalism and liberalism were regarded as one.
Yeah.
They were both part of the progressive quest to liberate people on the basis of self-determination and so forth. So the thinkers, the liberal and nationalist thinkers of the early 19th century were the same. This was both were regarded as a vehicle for liberation from arbitrary rule by dynastic what is known as despotic monarchies, and giving reign to the people's own wishes. But later, during the late 19th century, and obviously during expression of nationalism, it, for a good reason, acquired the bad name as something very dangerous. So some people have chosen patriotism as a more benign term, even though obviously patriotism has also had some of these negative overtones. So in my book, there is no real difference between the two. What thinker Jürgen Habermas has called constitutional patriotism, obviously in all places, is directed at the nation to which this constitution and patriotism belongs. So for me, it's the same.
Mm-hmm. So, because in a single nation we usually find different ethnic groups, is it that more recent nations are ground for more conflict between different ethnicities?
Unsustainable. One is that because we have a plurality of ethnic identities, and as a product of immigration and other causes, why you should have ethnic groups which are not part of the main ethnicity in the country, and sometimes do not even regard themselves as part of the nation. That this means that national and ethnic identity do not count or should not count. And on the other hand, you have the view which very much arose as a reaction against the first view, that national identity matters, and that we reject and object to the idea that our old national sense of identity, our historical culture do not matter and should give way to a new inherently multicultural societies. So that's why you have such a backlash across Western Europe and the United States against, for example, unlimited immigration, against those expressions of multiculturalism that challenge the very foundation and sometimes the very values, the liberal values of the societies in question. So I think these are the two polarized positions that you have. They have this tendency to push each other to extremes, whereas the common sense view is that national identities matter a great deal. People value them very much. And it has always been the case, and it remains the case, that there is never such cases of pure national identities. They are very rare. That they are always influx of people that do not belong originally to the new nation into these countries, that some of them over time are absorbed into the local identity, that some of them retain parts of their past identity, that this process is almost inevitable. But that we should remember that both the coherence, not the coherence, the endurance of the old traditions and old sense of identity and the influx of and plurality of other identities usually coexist, and there is no other way for them but to coexist, even in our modern societies.
Mm-hmm. Could this tell us something about, because Africa was very recently split between different countries? I mean, when the Europeans got out of it with the decolonization back in the 60s, starting in the 60s, I think. So could this explain at least partly why there's so much conflict there?
So partly yes, obviously, and the reason goes far back, before European imperialism, which is regarded as the scapegoat for everything that goes on in Africa. This is not the case. Pre-colonial Africa was a mosaic of ethnic group and tribes. So there was no such process of national amalgamation that you find in some other places around the world. And obviously, the Europeans, in some way, left their own legacy, and this is the borders that were drawn on the map with little regard for ethnic composition and identity. So some ethnic groups are split in two or three, but even if discounting this, it is still the case that there are in many of the African countries hundreds, sometimes dozens, of ethnic groups, of ethnic identities. And now there are two processes that take place. One of them is that they amalgamate into new nations, and partly this is done because of by adopting some kinds of a national language. That is, the local languages remain, but say the language of education and much of the language of the media is unified. And paradoxically, the only way to unify it is by adopting the language of the colonial power. So say in West Africa, for example, you see either French or English functioning as this language that is in the educational system and in the media. in the national media, they would adopt English or French as the national language, they have no other option, because had they adopted any of the local languages, this would be regarded as an affront by all the other ethnic communities. The same, by the way, much the same, by the way, exists in India, where the national language is basically, well, English. And some different in some different forms, the same applies to Indonesia and to the Philippines, a little differently that what I've described for Africa. So this is one route. That is the amalgamation of all these tribal communities, ethnic communities, into some form of national state. And this is, it's very important that this effort succeed, because the alternative is terrible mayhem. At the same time, however, in many cases, what you see is a breakdown of these states into civil war, sometimes into secession and partition of the country. We had this case in the Sudan, for example, which split into, and we have it in Eritrea, and we now have a kind of, an eruption of the ethnic tensions in Ethiopia, even though it has a very long history of unification stretching back to the Middle Ages. And in some countries of Western Africa, we remember this, the attempt by Biafra to secede in the late, in Nigeria, in the late 60s, which was crushed by force. So we have both tendencies, and I'm afraid that we have a lot more in store for the future.
Mm-hmm. So I think that there's an important distinction that we haven't talked about yet, that you make in the book, between civic and ethnic nations. Could you tell us about that?
So it's not that I'm making it; it's the literature that has been making it with respect to. So supposedly, the countries of Western Europe, such as France, such as Britain, were civic nations where identity was determined solely by citizenship, as opposed to Eastern Europe, where identity and the nationhood was determined by ethnicity. Mm-hmm. And I think this is again very misleading. And the reason why, both Britain and France could be regarded as civic was that they were so mighty and so confident in their identity that they had no doubt that anybody coming into their respective realms would adopt to the local culture. Would eventually become English or French. And this lasted for very long, practically until very recently. France, in particular, was very successful in assimilating all newcomers. Less successful now, hence why the problem, the question of the identity of the French nation now comes to the fore so powerfully. The same in Britain. So the truth of the matter is that there are very few nations, if any, who lack an ethnic character. Obviously, the character of the British nation, even if it's not so clearly defined, is Britishness, which means basically an extension of English identity, which very much took place in the British Isles themselves, that is over Wales and Scotland to a large degree, in Ireland, less successfully. In France, even France is often regarded as a paradigmatic case in the study of nationalism, but in fact, it's very much the exception rather than the rule, because it's true that in France, in medieval France, there was no one ethnic identity. There was a great mosaic of uh, of um, dialects, some of them descendants of Latin and others, not Celtic and German and so forth, and Basque and so forth. But it's the unique. France is a unique, successful case where the monarchy, on the one hand, over centuries, over half a millennium, even more, on the one hand, and the great charm and success and attraction of French culture succeeded over time in fusing all these different identities into a French identity, a process that was not completed until the early 20th century.
Yeah.
Until it was again challenged by Muslim immigration mainly. This sense of shared culture, of shared ethnicity, in the large majority of cases underlies also the so-called civic nations.
Mm-hmm. So, do you think that multiculturalism is a current political issue that we have to deal with? And if so, would there be one single best solution to deal with it? Because I guess that we can argue that multiculturalism and how to deal with immigrants from other cultures, other parts of the world, is one of the reasons behind the rise of extreme right wing or far right parties in Europe, for example.
Yeah, so absolutely. So it doesn't matter what I think. I mean, it doesn't matter what my views are. We see, we see what's taking place. So there was this huge ideological and social movement of multiculturalism, which was motivated by the best of motives. That is, that people have to, have to enjoy equality also in terms of their culture, that toleration, and even more than further than toleration, also um, the richness that comes with cultural diversities are important values in themselves. That the world is now very much open to population movements by way of immigration, and that we, in such an open world, this is what we need to expect as a reality, and we better adjust to it in terms of our values and ideology. And all these are a valid notion to a degree. But as I said before, if you push it to to extreme, if you try to tell people that this means that they have to give up on their historical identity, on their core culture, on the sense of nationhood, if this is what is to be expected of them, and obviously we are talking here when this sense of common identity is challenged by not by by small numbers or relatively small number, but by a deluge of newcomers, what you see basically is the kind of reaction that we have been seeing across Western Europe and in the United States. And people, there is we see resurgence of national sentiments, even in the most liberal countries, irrespective of the immigration. So take, for example, Belgium, which is binational. And it's thoroughly liberal. And this does not mean that people, want to give prime of place to their national, ethno-national identity. And you see it in Belgian politics, which is dominated by the national question. The same in Britain. With respect, I'm not, Ireland is a clear case, but Scotland, which has been part of the UK for 400 years. And you see it again, thoroughly liberal. I mean, the Scots have been equal partners to the UK, to the empire for centuries. And still you see how potent national identities are. Spain is an obvious example, both Catalonia, the Basque Country, and so forth. So to think that this is some kind of, some kind of manipulation or some kind of expression of a bygone sentiment is not to understand the basic motivations that drive human collectives. And once challenged, they react very forcefully, even in the most liberal of countries.
Mhm. Do you think that we will ever be able to go beyond the national identity to include or to develop a global identity and include all people across the world in our own group, let's say?
I think obviously that globalization is becoming is a process that is both a care, and in my view it has and it obviously has many benefits. Partly it's driven by economic factors. Partly it's driven by a greater cultural elements that are shared across the globe because of modern communication in all its aspects, and all this is may reduce does reduce hostility, war among the elements that help in doing all this. I think that we are very far, and again, I don't think that this should be regarded as either or. I don't see people in any foreseeable future giving up on their national identities, while also accepting supranational identities. So both these factors exist, and it would be rash to believe that people are going in an increasingly globalized and supranational reality are going to give up on their national identities. I don't see it coming anytime soon.
Mhm. So, one last question. Do you have any predictions as to how nations and national identities could evolve in the future? I mean, would it evolve to a more local kind of thing or more expansive, let's say, to, as I mentioned in the last question, to have more of a sense of a global identity or something like that?
So I'm not a prophet, so I won't venture any prophecies about the future. But I think that all these processes coexist, and which of them would become more potent is partly a matter of where you are talking, where in the world you are talking about. So I don't think that, obviously there would be parallels, but I don't think that the reaction would be quite the same in Europe, in East Asia, in Africa. All of them have very different realities. They are placed on different places on the trajectory of modernization, and there are some very other significant differences. So probably what we are going to see is all of the above. In what measure and in what geographical spread, I wouldn't venture to prophesize.
Okay, fair enough. So I will be leaving a link to your book in the description box of the interview. Just before we go, would you like to mention any other sources on the internet or elsewhere where people can get in touch with your work?
The book would be the best, I think, representation of my views in full.
Mm-hmm.
There are some scattered articles, but basically they build on the book.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Gat, it was a real pleasure to have you on the show again. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've been doing this channel for 3 years, bringing you top academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. And I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Even $1 would already be a great help. Otherwise, you also have links to PayPal in the description box of the interview. And please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button if you liked the interview. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litske, Anne Blanchett, Pereira Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Anjan Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollisey, Henrik Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Spinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugney, Alexander Dunbauer, Omri Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bulut, Nathan Nguyen, Staten T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Deza Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adaner Usmani, my producers Ezer Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Codriano, Luís Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Van Egdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers Michel Ruzieski, Rosie, and James Pratt. Thank you for all.